I know so many entrepreneurs, very cool, good people who are like just want to shut their eyes because they don't want to pay attention to real world stuff happening.
Kicking me out for selling things are now inviting me back to talk about like entrepreneurship and things like that.
They don't really want to know you, you know? And that's honestly what I think is missing in the community or in the entrepreneur community. I'll give some examples, but I've seen people lacking connection.
Most entrepreneurs are really just driven by something. The sense in which, like, I've worked for 3 billionaires. This is what I would have had to do for them. Guess what they wanted, provide it to them, and not get thanked. And do that again and again and again. It wasn't that they didn't appreciate what I did. Like, that was just the way they lived their life.
Hi everyone, this is Babar and back with another episode of Cut the BS. This time we're cutting the BS in Europe. We're in Spain, in Madrid, in one of the very cool, unique buildings called IE University, and it's a college that focuses a lot on modern style of education and learning. I have Joe here with me. He's kind enough to host us and talk to us about his experiences, his life, the role he plays in entrepreneurship in Spain, and also he's active part of this community, the IE University. So we'll talk to him more and see, where we can get the BS with Joe. Thank you, Joe. Thank you for being with us. We first time I'm talking to somebody in Europe.
Okay.
I think you're
Don't be scared. To your point.
the first guest for Cut the BS in Europe. So thank you for that. I'll quickly start with your life story. I'm sure you've told this to multiple people over your time and multiple interviews and stuff. But what's your story? Where you born, raised, before all the your career and your journey with this university and big things you've done? What's Joe before that?
Well, I've developed a narrative to talk about this. Yeah. Okay, so I call it the 246-810, right? Okay. Which is sort of an interesting way of doing it. So I'm teaching here now for more than 10 years as a professor at IE Business School, which has now become IE University. I guess I spend most of my time in the business school, but I do teach in the university as well. And I've been teaching for over 10 years, which is where the 10 comes from. Initially as an MBA student, and then I guess I got it's funny when you complain about things very often they say, okay, well then if you think there should be a course on this, you can only teach one. And I'm particularly interested in the area of scale up. I'm not that interested in startup. I think anyone can start. I think the question is, can you scale, right? So I tend to think not to talk about startups, but to talk about pre-scale ups. In other words, that you're thinking about scaling. I mean, coming from the part of the world that you come from, the world, the population is much bigger. People think in terms of scale a lot more naturally, whereas that doesn't always happen here. Yeah. So teaching for more than 10 years, I've lived in 8 countries, including Dallas, as we were discussing, but like New Jersey, whereas California, Netherlands, France, the UK, Ireland, where I was born, Spain, lots of different countries. So like 8 countries, which is not unusual for Irish people. We tend to, get around and move a lot. And if you had to choose one, what would that be? Well, I guess the people in Spain are good enough to tolerate me for 20 years, so it would be rude of me to say anything other than. But I always am open to a better offer. Everyone's always open to a better offer. If the penguins in Antarctica want to say, "Come be a penguin in Antarctica," maybe I'll consider it. And 6 is. I've co-founded 6 companies, which is, going way back to like .com days. It's the typical profile of I was starting companies in the schoolyard. I was the kind of guy who you talk to if you wanted to get hold of something. And so that's a very typical thing of entrepreneurs. Most people who start companies were doing this kind of thing, So the same schools that were kicking me out for selling things are now inviting me back to talk about like entrepreneurship and things like that. I always say I speak 4 languages, which is sort of important. I think it's a really annoying thing that they think English speakers are monolingual, and I think it's a huge issue that there are so many things interesting things that never find their way into the English language. So I obviously speak Spanish about a year, French. I lived in France for a while, and then Irish, which is, I guess not so much because the language before the British came, but maybe you and I can talk off camera about what that was like. Okay, I think we have. It's funny with the Indian people from India and Pakistan. you know, we have an awful lot in common in that respect. So the British left us, but in still ways they're still there.
Yeah.
And that's where the four comes from. And the two is I have two kids, two daughters. I always like to mention that. I think that's a very interesting thing, who are, you know, very important to me. And I think one of them will come and study here in our university next year. So we're really looking forward to that. But I think teaching is, there are many reasons why people teach. You mentioned that your father was a teacher, is that right?
Yeah.
You know, and it's interesting how, you know, there is this horrible phrase which, you know, those who can do and those who can't teach, and it couldn't be more wrong. That teaching keeps you relevant. You know, my job is to have to walk into a bunch of 18-year-olds on a Monday morning and try and be interesting and relevant. So you learn about all sorts of things, you know, the products they consume, the clothes they wear, the media, their attitude to the world, which just keeps you super interesting and relevant.
Yeah.
People tell me that I haven't changed in 20 years, you know, and because that's the sort of thing. Also, teaching gets you very involved in questions. About, you know, am I doing the right thing? You know, what jobs and sectors? And you just get a lot of information. A lot of people are very, you know, they really have a small bunch of friends, and that's really all they know. You know, I have up to as many as 500 students if you kind of, you know, gather together all the online people and all of that. And, you know, many of them are coming to my office and they talk to me about, I'm thinking of leaving consulting and starting my own company.
Yeah.
You know, this is what you know, I'm working for this company. This is really what I earn. This is what it's really like inside. So you learn an awful lot of things that you really don't read in the newspaper or you wouldn't come across. So I think teaching specifically in a business school, particularly in a high ranking business school, you learn an awful lot about the world. And I guess the final thing, and with this, I'll bring the introduction, my 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 introduction to the close, is that you learn a lot about people from different countries. You know, reading The Economist and the Financial Times, you really learn nothing about about the countries.
Yeah.
You know, where you have, you know, in your case, I guess someone from Pakistan saying, this is really what's going on in the country. This is really what's important. This is really what the young people think. And you just don't read that in the normal places, you know, BBC World or whatever. You have to have people. So, and I've always been interested, as you know, in Ireland, we were always interested in what was going on with the world. So because of that, I'm still really interested in people telling me about what's happening in Turkey. You know, right now we're very involved in what's happening. You know, there's students from Lebanon. You know, they're looking at what's happening in Syria. You know, students from Ukraine and Russia, and you know those kind of things. So these are not just abstract things that you see in the news. These are real life things that affect real life people.
Yeah.
And you know, guys, Russian guy, he can't go back to Russia because he's afraid of being conscripted. You know, another girl in Syria or in Lebanon, and she's worried about, you know, Syrians, how that will destabilize the country. You know, these are real life things, and it gives you a lot of perspective in terms of the world. And you know, there's too much kind of going on about like, oh, am I successful, or you know, these kind of like, you know, kind of optimizers that you see on social media. So a healthy balance to that is people talking about, you know what, if you're not living in fear, you know, you're doing pretty well.
Yeah.
And not to kind of like, you know, sort of torment or torture yourself just because you don't have a six-figure salary.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting segue. We'll hold this thought for later conversation, but how some parts of the world, so let's say the US right now, is very cut off from reality. And they want to be cut off from reality. It's not about being cut off. You know, in this age, you can know everything that you want to know. I know so many entrepreneurs, very cool, good people who are like, just want to shut their eyes because they don't want to pay attention to real world stuff happening.
So I teach in courses in NYU and Brown and Berkeley, various US, and you know, some people don't like to be asked, like your case, you hear your first question, Pakistan, tell me about your parents, tell me about, a lot of people don't like to be asked those questions. I ask those questions because I'm genuinely interested. If there's a food I've never eaten that I should eat, if there's a place I've never visited that I want to visit, you know, if there's a sport I've never seen that I want to play, like that's always been my approach. But people, you know, I find in the US are you say like, where are you from? Brazil. and they kind of go, "That's lovely," and then move on.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and whereas you could be from Porto Alegre, or you could be from, Salvador Bahia. You could, miles apart and very different. So that's a lack of curiosity. Listen, there's a fantastic book, Brotopia, by Emily Chang, who's a reporter on talks just about weirdness of Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
I mean, there's Uncanny Valley as well, which is another. I've just talked about the general weirdness of it. I lived there as well, and I was there 4 weeks ago, and it's not what I grew up with. And I grew up with very, in the Irish language, we say, it's our Scala Kela Varnadini, which is in the shadow of each other is how we grow. So this is the thing about you. Your community is as much part of you. And you celebrate when someone does well in your community, you celebrate that. And when someone needs your help, they need your help.
Yeah.
Anyone who comes to you, if your land borders, if someone needs a field or something like that. And it's very much the thing. So I couldn't, if I have, as we say, if I have broken bread with you, now that I've met you and spoke to you, I like, there's no way I just ignore your calls. When I've met you and breathed the same air as you, that to me is a connection.
Yeah, entrepreneurship is very money and numbers driven than morality and values driven. They say stuff, but that's the truth about it. So, 10 years in this college of teaching, 8 countries you lived in, 6 companies you've co-founded, 4 languages you speak, and 2 daughters. Lovely description. I better have something like that one day.
And just before you move on, you have to learn. I am very insistent on people introducing themselves. If I had a 20-session class, I would spend the first 2 sessions. Tell me about yourself. Where did you grow up? Tell me about your parents. Do you have a dog? Do you have a football team, cricket team, whatever? Tell me, because I think it's really important. I used to play a lot of sport. I used to play a lot of rugby and also Irish sports. And, you have to trust your teammates. In rugby, you trust your guy. The guy could come through and you could actually get very hurt. So you had to be able to trust. So you had to kind of know each other and know the person and want to keep going to get the guy to make the tackle so that the guy doesn't get through and then become a problem for your. So you have those kind of bonds and. So that's always been a thing that I always encourage people to, and some people, it's interesting, you read the evaluations of the course afterwards, and so many people will tell you, initially I was thinking, why are we wasting 2 sessions on this? But then I realized that, hey, the guy who I was looking at for 3 years, I had no idea that we used to live in the same town. So that's something that I insist on, and that's what you pay for in a school like this. I mean, you can pay half the price somewhere else and have double the amount of people in the class. You pay a lot of money, but for that you get small classes and everyone knows everybody's name. And that's the value of it.
And that's the biggest thing to take away from college anyways, I think. Especially unless you're doing super technical education, I think college is sort of dying down if it's not done the right way, especially something that I see over here being done. Quickly coming to teaching and entrepreneurship, because I want to understand your thoughts about teaching and entrepreneurship together. I said my father is a teacher and an entrepreneur. He's not done multiple businesses. Quite a few failed ones, a few successful ones. But he's been a teacher, a giver, and an entrepreneur. So how do you think, what are the goods and more so the bads or the learnings that you have from this journey of teaching and entrepreneurship together side by side?
Okay, well, the first thing is a thing that's not a nice thing to say, but it's true, and I believe it much more strongly that even so, which is that nobody should be teaching entrepreneurship who hasn't started a business. And that can be a controversial. We've actually split our department in 2 parts. We have the researchers who do research, into entrepreneurship area, and that's fine. But we don't expect them to come into a class and create an atmosphere. So this is the thing, especially post-pandemic. Now, with YouTube and stuff like that when I grew up, a lot of the knowledge was only available by going to the classroom and hearing it from the professor. There was no YouTube, there was no podcasts, there was no that. So my classes are increasingly, the professor has to be able to create an atmosphere just by their personality and their stories and their existence. And I mean, it's a sort of, maybe I'm giving away the keys to the kingdom here, but I think it's all, you shouldn't be afraid to do that. But I purposely, try to have an interesting life because I think that makes me relevant. So I'm like, I'm just back from Korea. This year I spend maybe 15 weeks of the year traveling to going to different countries. I think it's really important when you meet someone to be able to say you've been to their country.
Yeah.
Because otherwise someone looks at you like, what do you even know about me? You can't be teaching people from India if you don't know the difference between Mumbai, Delhi, Hyderabad, Calcutta, even Goa, even, it's a kind of a, just even know that so many Indians don't speak Hindi, there's just basic things about if you're speaking in a global. So I always take the time to visit those places and to know the names of the companies from those countries. I think it's really important. I can name the Tata Group. I can tell you the history, Rajan Tata, the Parsi. I can talk to you about Reliance. I can talk to you about mobile. I can talk to you about crazy weddings. I can talk to you about all of these kind of things. I can talk to you, Indian bad boy billionaires on Netflix is a reference.
Yeah.
Scam, the Harjit Mehta story. These kind of things are these are very much even though I'm a white guy and in Ireland we're very white. I think it's important to be able to recognize what things we have in common, which is why I mentioned about having both have the British, arrive on our shores and spend a lot of time. So I think that's the thing that I've learned most of all, that people, irrespective of where you're from, have more in common than they have are different. We might look different, we might eat different foods, we might pray to different gods, but there's a sense in which we all want to be respected. We all want to be around people who are having interesting conversations. We all want to be loved. And that doesn't matter really that's a basic humanity. So when you're teaching entrepreneurship, you have to get into that. And almost all entrepreneurs, whether they hide it or not, have had something that has happened to them that has meant this thing. They have to go towards it. They cannot run away from it. And a lot of it is trying to find out whether you have that. Okay? So there's a professor in Stanford, DJ File, who talks about trigger moments in their life. And almost everyone who's gone on to create a great business has had a trigger moment in their life. Something that has happened to them. They were disrespected. I mean, you look at Larry Ellison, Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, they were all adopted,
Yeah.
Now, of course, the other way it works is that Mark Zuckerberg and Gates were from rich families, so they had access to certain kinds of education that gave them a particular advantage. And so it doesn't hold in all cases. But in most cases, people have had, in my own case, my mother died when I was young. I was sent away to a boarding school. There was real kind of there was no contact with my parents. There was no phones. There was the phone was this kind of place that you would walk past and you had to ask special permission. You couldn't write to your father without the letters being checked. You were on your own. They dropped you off and they collected you at Christmas. And this is age 13. So it was an Irish speaking school as well, right? It wasn't even in my native language. So you have this kind of thing, and it made me very kind of I have to solve the problem. Do you understand? Okay, there's no cavalry coming. There's no cavalry coming. Now, it helped that I was good at sports and stuff like that. When you're young, being good at sports is a thing. But this is the point about entrepreneurship, is trying to make people realize they are entrepreneurs when many of them don't. And many of them get dragged, towards consulting or banking, or because to be fair, they're very good at what they do. The bankers arrive and the consultants arrive and they dress very well and they talk to you about the importance of what they do and the salary is good and they make it very easy for you. and good people get dragged into that, and instead those people are actually entrepreneurs, and they're suppressing something in them, which is something that you have in your own WhatsApp, which is the idea of being a builder, and if you are a builder, nothing other than building will make you happy. So that's what I focus on. Are you a builder, and can I inspire that side of you to the sense at which only building something can make you happy?
Yeah, and I'm sure this gives a great sense of satisfaction being a giver, right? So you're basically giving to the community in a way which will produce so many more entrepreneurs, or people who are achieving their dreams, or building towards their dreams. Coming back to the teaching part of it, right? And as an entrepreneur, again, a lot of us are givers. You want to give, pass on, help, guide, learn along the way. What are some traits that you will see in an entrepreneur that can lead them to being a good teacher?
Being a good teacher, it often works the other way. I mean, in the companies I've co-founded, I was never the crazy sort of obsessive person. I was always the person that's with that person who could understand and kind of tidied up their messes. You know what I mean? It's like that's an often thing that people think that I was the crazy one. I was the rainmaker. And I was never, because it takes a whole different level beyond that. So that's the the things about it is, I think, most entrepreneurs are really just driven by something. And I mean, to the sense in which, like, I've worked for 3 billionaires, and, a lot of that was this is what I would have had to do for them. Guess what they wanted, provide it to them, and not get thanked. And do that again and again and again. And it wasn't that they didn't appreciate what I did. It wasn't, but there was just like, that was just the way they lived their life. They expected, they would get something that said, be at this place for this thing, and I would have had to have the 30 people in that room. I would have had to have the right kind of room, the right kind of ambience. Would have had to do all of that. The person would come in, have the activity, enjoy, leave, and that would be it, and you wouldn't get any thanks out. But both of us understood the game. He was a billionaire. He was in a position to do that. And if I didn't want to do that, then there was that's the door. And it's not a thing you can do for very long. So I don't think entrepreneurs are great teachers. I think that they are, they can be, everyone talks about the Steve Jobs thing, you could learn about crafting and, that you have to make things that are brilliant, the things that the customer can't see. But I think that was for Steve. I don't think that was for Johnny Ive or Tony Fadell or any of the other people around him. And I still don't think that entrepreneurs are, I know the former PA of Jeff Bezos, Anne Hyatt, who teaches here, she talks a lot about that. She would have to come in the morning at 3:00, get the newspapers, read the newspapers for Jeff, to be able to highlight anything that he needed to read. So she would have to read like 20 pages and find one article for him and just do that again and again. And it wasn't, Jeff absolutely appreciated what she did and would absolutely give her a glowing reference for anything she needed. But there wasn't a lot of human work. Do you understand? So but you do that to be around interesting people, and you do that around the biggest thing that you understand working with a billionaire is what high performance is. What you're expected to do. And I was working with a company who's would not allow me to mention their name, but we were trying to get a certain speaker, I contacted him. He was living in Miami. And it just became very obvious that they were absolutely happy with sending a jet to get him, that kind of thing. And you need to know that without asking or making a big deal about it, And I'm helping, this time of year, I help a lot of students get jobs. And a lot of the time they're calling me and saying, do you think she understands, what high performance is? Do you think that she understands that, just making a PowerPoint isn't enough? That you have to get a real insight. You have to try and what they call, particularly when people are going for VCs, you have to have a view about where the world is going. And that's all the time they're asking. So I think I wouldn't, working for entrepreneurs, it isn't all fun, and you never get any warmth really.
Yeah.
And because a lot of them, as you say, they were adopted or they came from difficult situation. If you had brutality done to you, sometimes you can't really show love. You know, that's we see a lot of it with we have a lot of people here who they come from entrepreneurship families, but their parents 20 years ago had been refugees from other countries. So they went there having had something, being war, famine, whatever. They escaped to the Dominican Republic. I'm thinking of one case, a Palestinian family. And the father just, loves his kids, but can never, ever tell them that. He tells me that. Like, I spend so much time talking to parents, I get phone calls from, it's really fun. You're walking down the street and you get this call from somebody and he says, it's like from the switchboard or from the president's office or something. And he's like, there's someone this guy wants to speak to you. And this could be a big executive. So he rings the president's office and then you're like, hello. And he's like, they say, I am. And they would say the name. You're teaching my son. And I'm like, at that point, you're wondering, is this going to be really good or really bad? And he said, I like what you're doing. Keep it up. And that's it. And that's the goal, and that's like, he then moves on to the rest of the stuff. So, but there was another guy and it was just really kind of, the son was telling me one thing about my father hates me and, he doesn't have any time for me and all that. And then the other guy was saying like, getting a hug from my son, would be the thing that meant, and I was like, can I not get you two together,
Yeah.
But the guy would be absolutely, he had a difficult first 12 years of his life. And he's like, you cannot show weakness ever. That's his big thing. And his son just couldn't understand it. So this is what, like, do you see how my job is super interesting? My job is, and then imagine how great you feel if, in that case, I didn't manage to bring them together. Imagine how great you feel if you can bring the people together. If you, whenever people I know who are depressed, how you get out of them is by making them feel useful. And by making them feel useful is how they help people. And helping people is the best way to feel fabulous. Helping people is a gift. So if I can bring those people together, the father and the son, like there was another guy, a South African guy, I tell this story on another pod, and he got this really cool job. And he was walking around telling everyone, this guy's job. He was with Microsoft, I was like, God, like South Africa is a country with like so much happening, and I don't like the fact that their good people are like not going back to try and help give back to their country. Forget about it. He said, like, don't take that job, go back and work with your father, And then he told me, he called me one day and he said, can I come and see you? And I was like, yeah, of course you can. And he was like, and then he told me the story that after my conversation, he thought about it and he decided not to take the job, and he went to work with his father. And then sadly one day his father dropped dead and died. But because of something I had said literally in a corridor on a way by, he had had 6 months when they really got to know each other. And otherwise he would have been on the other side of the world. So that's the thing about, like, I have so many entrepreneurs who have a lot of money but have, it's a funny kind of a thing. They look at me and they say, God, I'd love to be you, and I'm like, I wouldn't mind being you. Right? But that's the thing, which is that their ability to focus on stuff has made them very successful. But a lot of them literally have to just keep creating companies because otherwise that's all they can really do. But they weren't made for kind of like civilian life. They were only made for like warlike, war. So I mean, it's a super interesting, and entrepreneurship is, and that's why we talk, like, accounting professors have really stories to tell. They can talk about like, and then the FRS 7, and then I said to him, no, it's FRS 9. It's like, so that's what I mean. So it's entrepreneurship is. The other professors always give out about the fact that, we're the guys that the media interview because we just have unbelievably interesting stories to tell. And we have human stories to tell. And that's why that's why I think it's, my job is, is never, it's fantastically interesting. And
Yeah.
the final thing I'll say, and I know you have another question, but like, what's really amazing is the people who meet and get married. You know, it would really, like, in a world of, you know, of wars, of conflict, of, you know, bad things. It's amazing to see like a Pakistani guy and like a Brazilian girl. And you would think, like, you know, wow, they have like nothing in common.
Yeah.
But they, you know, they connect and they love each other like you would not believe.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. And they, because they've had to kind of like work at the relationship, they work at the relationship. You know, and we have another podcast which talks about people who met here. And in general, the other thing, of course, like the socioeconomic parts usually line up, you know? So you usually have like a wealthy person from Pakistan, a wealthy person from Brazil. So that gives them a kind of a good chance. But it's an amazing story to talk about, you know, how they, by committing to somebody who is from a different culture to you, how you learn so much more about yourself. And that if you're prepared to make that investment, how your life is then so much richer.